Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into project cost management.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So we asked you to send in materials that you're working with, and you sent us chapter7.pdf.
Yep.
So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today.
All right.
And, project cost management, it's one of those things that we all kind of maybe deal with whether we realize it or not.
Right.
But it's, this is really targeted towards people that are actually, managing projects. But even if you're not a project manager, I think there's a lot to learn from going through this chapter.
For sure.
So I guess to kick things off, why don't we just kind of start with like a basic definition?
Okay.
What is project cost management?
So project cost management is really the process is required to plan, estimate, budget, and control costs. So it's really that whole kind of piece of it all the way through.
So it's not just like, just coming up with a number and then hoping for the best.
Exactly.
There's actually like a framework and a system for doing it.
You got it. Yeah. A process, a methodology.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess the first step in this process, according to chapter7.pdf, is plan cost management.
Right.
So what does that entail? What does that mean?
So plan cost management basically means set yourself up for success. What are all the things that could potentially impact the cost and making sure that you have a plan to address those things.
Okay, so it's like creating that framework so that you can be successful later on.
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I thought one interesting thing that the chapter points out is that, there are different stakeholders, and they may actually measure project costs differently.
Absolutely.
So I think the example they use is if you're, ordering a piece of equipment, one stakeholder might record the cost like as soon as they order it.
Right.
Whereas another stakeholder might not actually, put it on the books until it arrives. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point. Like you really have to consider like who are the stakeholders and how are they actually going to be looking at this?
And how are they going to be measuring the cost?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the thing to think about there is, it's not always necessarily right or wrong.
Right.
It's just different methodologies. And as long as you're consistent,
yeah,
that's the key.
Yeah, you got to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
And another thing I thought was kind of interesting, they talk about how, organizational culture can actually affect how costs are managed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for example, if you're in a really risk-averse organization, they may be a lot more conservative in terms of how they're managing costs. Whereas if you're in a more innovative organization, they might be willing to take more risks.
Right.
So even that, just kind of the company culture can kind of bleed into how you're thinking about costs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've seen that firsthand where you have two organizations that are very similar.
Right.
But the way they approach risk and cost management is completely different.
Yeah. And that can even affect, even if you have like a really accurate estimate, it might get pushed back just based on, that culture of risk aversion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have to be so cognizant of your surroundings when you're thinking about cost management.
Okay, so we've kind of talked about plan cost management, so kind of setting up that framework for how you're going to do it.
Right.
So I guess the next step would be estimate costs.
Right.
So what do we mean by estimate costs?
So an estimate costs is basically your best guess of how much it's going to cost at a certain point in time. So you have to remember that it's just an estimate based on the information that's available to you at that point in time.
I think it's going to change, right?
Exactly.
As you get more information, the estimate's going to evolve and change.
It should get more and more accurate over time.
Right. So I think in the chapter they talk about, early on you might have like a rough order of magnitude or ROM estimate.
Yeah.
Which is just kind of like, a ballpark.
A ballpark, yeah.
And then as you get, more and more defined in the project, you can create a more definitive estimate, which is going to be, a lot more accurate.
Exactly.
So it's not like you just come up with one number and you're stuck with that number forever.
Right.
It's going to change over time.
And it should change over time, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And they talk about, there are different methods for actually estimating costs.
Yes.
Things like analogous estimating,
right,
where you're looking at, past projects,
right,
parametric estimating, bottom-up estimating, three-point estimating.
Right. There's so many different ways to do it.
So I don't think we need to get too much in the weeds on the specific methods here.
Right.
But I think the main takeaway is that, there are different ways to do it, and you have to choose the right method for your project.
Yeah. And it's going to depend
Yeah.
It's going to depend on what you're doing. It's going to depend on what information you have.
Right.
It's going to depend on your organization.
Yeah. And I think one really important point that they make is that, you have to consider risk and uncertainty when you're estimating costs.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's always going to be things that you don't know.
Yeah.
And things are going to change.
Right. Nothing ever goes according to plan.
Right. So they talk about building in a contingency reserve to account for that.
Mm-hmm.
So what is a contingency reserve exactly?
So contingency reserve is essentially an amount of money that you set aside to account for those unknowns, those things that you know might happen, but you're not really sure.
So it's like a buffer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a bucket.
So if something comes up, you've got a little bit of wiggle room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like your, rainy day fund.
Yeah.
But for your project.
I like that, a rainy day fund for your project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've talked about plan cost management, estimate costs. What's the next step in the process?
The next step is determine budget.
Okay. So how's that different from what we've already been talking about?
So this is where a lot of people kind of get confused because we talk about cost baselines and project budgets.
Mm-hmm.
And people often think those are the same thing.
Right.
But they're not.
Yep.
So a cost baseline is essentially the approved budget for all the work that's included in your project scope.
Okay.
That includes your contingency reserve.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's part of your cost baseline.
Okay.
But it doesn't include something called management reserve.
Oh, okay. So what's a management reserve?
So a management reserve is an amount of money that is set aside for unforeseen work that's outside the scope of your project. So it's not for risks that you've already identified.
Wow.
It's for things that, you couldn't even think of.
So like a black swan event or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like something that's totally out of left field.
Got it.
And that is controlled by senior management. They're the ones who decide if they want to use that money.
So you don't even really consider that as part of like your working budget?
It's not included in the cost baseline.
Okay.
That's a key point to remember.
Okay, so the cost baseline is kind of your working budget.
It is.
And then the management reserve is like this extra pot of money that's kind of held by the higher ups.
Yeah, it's like break in case of emergency.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And then they talk about in the chapter an S-curve.
Yes.
Which I think is kind of visually how we can represent like costs throughout the project.
Right.
So what is an S-curve?
So an S-curve, basically, it's a visual representation of your cost expenditures over time.
Okay.
And it gets its name from the fact that it looks like an S.
Okay.
Right.
Got it.
And it shows that at the beginning of your project, costs are relatively low.
Right.
As you get more into the execution phase, they increase rapidly.
Okay.
And then as you get towards the end, they start to taper off again.
Yeah, so it's like that slow ramp up
Mm-hmm.
and then a big spike in the middle.
Yes.
And then back down.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And chapter 7 actually has a visual representation of this figure 7 to 9.
Oh, okay.
If you want to take a look at that.
So the listener can actually see that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've kind of covered the first 3 processes of project cost management,
Right.
which are plan cost management, estimate costs, and determine budget.
Mm-hmm.
What's the final step?
The final step is control costs.
Okay. And that sounds pretty self-explanatory, but I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
Oh, there's definitely more to it. Yeah.
Okay, so control costs. So I'm guessing that means making sure that, we're staying on budget
It does.
throughout the project.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process. It's not something you just do at the end.
Right. You don't just want to wait until the end and see how you did.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you want to be monitoring it constantly throughout the life of the project.
So, for our listener out there, how can understanding these concepts help them? Maybe they're not a project manager.
Sure.
But, they're working on projects.
Mm-hmm.
How can this benefit them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even if you're not the project manager, it's good to have an understanding of these concepts so you can at least ask the right questions.
Right.
If you're involved in a project and you see costs starting to get out of control or you don't understand why a certain decision was made,
Right.
you can at least have an intelligent conversation with the project manager.
Yeah. So it's kind of like empowering yourself.
Exactly.
To be able to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and to be able to speak the language.
Yeah. And to understand, why decisions are being made.
Right.
So we've talked about the 4 main processes of project cost management.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else in the chapter that really stood out to you or that you thought was really important?
Yeah, I really wanted to circle back to earned value management.
Okay.
Because I think that's such a powerful tool
Yep.
for controlling costs. And, we talked about the 3 key dimensions: planned value, earned value, and actual cost.
Right.
But the chapter actually goes into a lot of detail about different ways that you can analyze cost performance.
Okay, so can you give me an example? Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
Sure, yeah. So, you can calculate things like schedule variance,
Okay.
which tells you if you're ahead or behind schedule.
Okay, and how do you actually calculate that?
So schedule variance is basically earned value minus planned value.
Okay, so if your earned value is higher than your planned value, that means you're ahead of schedule.
You got it, yeah.
Okay,
And if it's less than your planned value,
that means you're behind.
you're behind schedule.
Okay.
And then there's cost variance, which tells you if you're over or under budget.
Okay, so how do you calculate that?
So cost variance is earned value minus actual cost.
Okay, so if your earned value is higher than your actual cost, you're under budget.
You're under budget, yeah.
Which is great.
Which is great.
And if it's lower,
You're over budget.
then you need to look into things.
Yeah, you need to start to figure out why X is going on.
So these are like tools that you can use to really monitor things throughout.
Exactly. Yeah. They're great tools for monitoring your project performance, and they can help you identify potential problems early on.
Okay, so it's like you're saying, it's an ongoing process.
Yes.
You're constantly monitoring these variances,
Right, exactly.
and that allows you to make adjustments as needed.
Yeah, you don't want to wait until the end of the project
Right.
to find out that you're way over budget or way behind schedule.
It's too late then.
Right, exactly. And then the chapter actually even takes it a step further and introduces indexes like the Schedule Performance Index and the Cost Performance Index.
Okay.
Have you heard of those?
I've heard of them, yeah.
So these are basically ratios that are calculated using the variances.
Okay.
So Schedule Performance Index, or SPI,
Mm-hmm.
is earned value divided by planned value. And Cost Performance Index, or CPI,
Okay.
is earned value divided by actual cost.
Okay, and those just basically make it even easier to see, where you're at.
Yeah, it gives you a quick snapshot of your project performance relative to your plan.
Okay, so it's like a quick way to assess things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So anything else about control costs that we should touch on?
Well, I mean, we talked about forecasting a little bit.
Right.
And, that's a key part of cost control is being able to predict what the final project cost is going to be.
Right, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here is make sure that we hit that final number.
Exactly, yeah. We want to make sure that we come in on budget.
Or under budget, preferably.
Or under budget, exactly, yeah.
So are there different ways to forecast costs?
There are a number of different methods.
Right.
Some are more complex than others, but the main idea is to use all of the information that's available to you to make the most accurate prediction possible.
So that includes, historical data, current performance,
right?
Even your own intuition and judgment.
Yeah. Your expert judgment is important as well.
Yeah. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people don't realize, that it's not just like plugging numbers into a formula.
Right.
There's actually like an art to this.
There is. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's important to document all of that.
Yeah.
All of those assumptions and the reasoning behind your forecasts.
Right.
So that, you can learn from it later on.
Right. So that you can go back and see if you were right or wrong and why.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we move on to the final part of this deep dive, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on from this chapter?
Yeah, there's one more thing I wanted to mention. I thought it was really interesting. They talk about earned schedule.
Earned schedule. Okay. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, so earned schedule is kind of an extension of earned value management.
Okay.
But instead of looking at cost performance, it looks at schedule performance.
Okay, so it's like the same idea, but applied to time.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's a way of measuring how efficiently you're managing time on the project.
Okay, so it's not just about, are we ahead of schedule, behind schedule?
Right.
It's like, how effectively are we using the time that we have?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I like that. Because I think sometimes, you can be on schedule.
Right.
But you're not really being efficient.
Exactly. Yeah, you could be on schedule, but you're working a lot of overtime.
Yeah.
Or you're using a lot more resources than you need to.
Okay, so this kind of gives you a better picture of...
It gives you a more nuanced view of your schedule performance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here in part 2.
We have, yeah.
Are you ready to wrap things up with some final thoughts?
I think so, yeah. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about project cost management.
We have.
And I had to say, I feel like I've learned a ton.
That's great.
So why don't we just kind of do a quick recap for our listener out there?
Okay.
So we started with just the basic definition of project cost management.
Right.
And then we went through those 4 main processes, planning, estimating, budgeting, and controlling costs.
Those are the big ones.
Yeah. And we talked about a lot of different tools and techniques, like contingency reserves and management reserves.
Right.
The S-curve, earned value management.
All very important concepts.
Yeah. And, we even touched on some more advanced stuff.
Right.
Like schedule variance and cost variance, forecasting, even earned schedule.
Lots of good stuff in there.
Yeah. And I think, one of the main takeaways for me is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely.
You really have to tailor your approach based on the specific project and the organization.
Yeah, and the industry.
Yeah.
And even the people involved. I mean, every project is unique.
Yeah, you really have to think about it and make it work for your specific situation.
Absolutely.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to kind of circle back to something we talked about at the beginning.
Okay.
Which is that understanding project costs can really benefit anyone who's involved in a project, not just project managers.
Yeah, I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
If you're working on a project and you understand how the budget works,
right,
you're going to be able to make better decisions. You're going to be able to communicate better with the project manager.
Right.
And you're just going to be a more valuable member of the team.
And even, anticipating potential problems.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you see things going off track,
right,
if you have that understanding, you can raise a flag and say,
exactly,
hey,
yeah,
we might be going over budget here.
Yeah, and it's all about being proactive.
Right.
Right.
Instead of reactive.
Exactly.
Which is what we want to do. We want to be proactive.
Absolutely.
Okay, so for our listener out there, what's the one thing you want them to remember from this whole deep dive?
I would say this. Project cost management is not about being a math genius.
Right.
It's about understanding the concepts and making informed decisions.
Yeah, it's about having that awareness.
Exactly.
Of the financial side of things.
Right. And, even if you're not a project manager, these concepts can still help you be more successful in your career.
I think that's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And we hope you learned a lot about project cost management.
Yeah, hopefully you can put some of this into practice.
Yeah.
In your own work.
All right, that's it for today.
See you next time.
See ya.